Hey YouTube, I've made the comment before that my m340i reminds me a lot of the e39 M5. Well, I think it's time to actually see if what I said was true, because standing here in front of me, I have an e39 M5. This is not just any e39 M5. This car actually has the Dynon S2 package, which increases power from 394 to 471 horsepower through a bunch of CARB legal, which is California emissions, parts, including the intakes, headers, software, all this great stuff. Really nice driving car, and we're going to compare it with the m340i. So obviously these are separated by 2 decades of progress. They are very similar. One of the funny things about the growth of the 3 Series is that it's gotten to be almost exactly the same size as the e39. The e39 is about 2 inches or 3 inches longer, but visually very, very similar cars from a size perspective. I prefer the styling of the e39. It's a very purposeful looking car. A lot of the criticism of BMW during this time was that the cars were too conservative and too similar. I know that a lot of people describe them as same sausage cut in different lengths, and I can see that. The e39, the e46, and the equivalent 7 Series were pretty similar looking cars. You can see a lot of the same roots in the cars, the open grille, the kidney grills, and the way the engine bays come together. But I think what we're really here to see is how similarly do they drive. The e39 and the G20 LCI are similar in weight. This won't be a great direct comparison because the G20 has the factory fresh Michelin Pilot Sport 4S, and we have some Continental Extreme contacts from 2014 on the e39, so this won't be a great subjective test from a grip perspective, but we should be able to get an idea of the character of the cars and drive them around a little bit to see what we think. Let's first go for a drive in the e39. I really loved these cars when they first came out. They were the fastest sedan and the highest horsepower available of any car when they were released here in the US in 1999. The e39 was sort of a halo car. I remember I had an e36 M3 at the time when this came out, and these cars with their amazing high revving V8 and beefy sound were definitely something that I was excited about. This car is over 20 years old now. Fantastic car, but time has definitely moved on in terms of the in-car electronics and a lot of power and weight. I mean, a modern M5 makes 50% more power than this car does. In terms of size, the modern M5 is a good 300 or 400 pounds heavier than an E39. With the switch to electronic steering, a lot of older cars have a lot of charm in the steering. The steering in the e39 M5 is not one of the strong suits. The steering is accurate, it's slow, has not a ton of feeling coming out of it. The engine note of this car is definitely a highlight though. It sounds pretty amazing when you rev it. The controls are all tidy. This particular car has a short shifter in it that I'm not a huge fan of. It actually shifts all right during the normal gears, but it's pretty easy to find first gear instead of reverse at stoplights, which is not the most fun. This car also has a Dinan's JRZ suspension. It rides probably better than the factory car ever did. So again, not a great direct comparison, but it'll be fun nonetheless. Definitely have to love the sounds that come out of this car. Well, it's certainly possible to hustle this car. It's doesn't love it. The turn-in is good, but not great. There's a little bit of understeer present that you can balance out with the throttle, but the overall handling is definitely a little understeery. The damping is good, probably due to those really nice dampers this car has, but the body control, this is a big, feels like heavy car that turning is probably not the thing that it's best suited for. The thing it probably is best suited for is acting as a GT car, cruising down the road comfortably with a big powerful motor behind it. It does sound fantastic, and it's definitely not fun on twisty roads, but it'll be an interesting comparison with the m340i on the same roads, being that the m340i is a little bit lighter, although not much. One of the things I was expecting out of this car was throttle response, and it certainly has that. This is one of the only big sedans I know of that actually ship with individual throttle bodies for each cylinder. So there's 8 throttle bodies under that big plastic cover in the engine bay, which is cool. And throttle response is absolutely instantaneous and easy to dial in. It's probably easier to modulate than the turbo motor in the m340i. From a power perspective though, BMW does underrate the turbo motors quite a bit, and I think this is definitely an example thereof, because on paper this car should have almost 100 horsepower more than the m340i, but it doesn't feel as fast to me. Throttle response is better because there's no turbo, but the mild hybrid system in the LCI m340i definitely makes up for a good part of that. From a driver involvement point of view, obviously having a manual transmission makes the car feel more alive in your hands. You're just doing more when you're driving. Certainly flappy paddles can be faster in the right hands and are easier to drive, but I've always loved driving a manual on a twisty road. On a racetrack, yeah, you know, I admit I do prefer an automatic transmission. Not the world's best driver, so I like to think about driving and not necessarily shifting. But on a twisty road, driving a good manual transmission is always a treat. And this car has a good manual transmission. The shift lever is a little long. out of the console. But in this case, especially with the short shifter, the throws are short and crisp. I'm personally not a huge fan of short shifters. I love the fact that they tighten up the action and take out slop. But in this case, the throws are so short that it gets a little bit in the way of the driving experience. And it's too bad that the steering isn't more communicative, because having the experience of driving a manual transmission with numb steering is not as great. But still, it's always a treat to drive a big, naturally aspirated motor that sounds great with the manual transmission. Okay, let's take a quick look at the E39's interior. I think these interiors have actually aged quite well. You get all the information you need in these the multifunction display at the bottom with these beautiful large gauges. BMW went to this sort of odd light background with white print on it. The gauges are much more readable at night. You can see on the tachometer that the LEDs will indicate the state of warmth of the car. When you first start the car, it shows the orange LEDs all the way up to 4,000 RPM, so you don't get too hot and heavy with the car before it's ready. And you've got the odometer, outside temperature in miles, plus a multifunction display at the bottom, warning lights surrounding the headlight controls, and then you even have steering wheel controls. You've got volume and track, which is up and down instead of left and right, but then the cruise control settings on the steering wheel. Center console wise, well, this is where this car certainly is starting to look a little dated. This 20-year-old onboard computer looks pretty ancient. There is a CD player. Oh, actually no, sorry, this is a tape deck in this car. And then a CD changer in the trunk. AC controls are identical looking chiclets, still in good shape. You've got the sport and DSC buttons below that. Locking buttons in the center, the manual transmissions. You can see the shift lever itself is fairly long and has short action with the short shifter. Reverses, I guess, not too hard to find. I don't know why I was screwing that up earlier. The M-specific rear view mirror, which is starting to show its age, but was oval shaped, which is sort of novel back then. And the E39 also had this nice Alcantara roof, and the dash plastics are textured nicely. They certainly aren't as nice as full leather, even not as nice as the Sensitech in the dashboard in the M340i, but overall still a fairly respectable interior that's aged reasonably well. If you don't look too closely at the onboard computer, or if you were to put a new head unit in, I'm sure that would liven it up quite a bit. This particular car has the two-tone seats with the gray leather inserts. From an interior room perspective, certainly I appreciate the low cowl of this car, low sills, and the width. This car feels quite a bit wider than the 340i. From a spaciousness perspective, feels pretty good from that perspective. Okay, I'm here in the M340i, and I'm going to go drive the same roads I just did in the M5 in this car. Let's see how 20 years of progress have affected. Well, the first thing that you notice is that in Sport Plus, BMW is very, very concerned about the throttle response of a turbocharged motor, so that the throttle is super jumpy compared to the E39. although very responsive for a turbo motor, especially if you've driven turbos from the 80s and 90s. This is a very, very responsive turbo motor. It has very little of the downsides of throttle response and turbo lag that you got out of turbo motors historically. It's also geared quite a bit shorter than most cars were back in the day. Given 8 speeds, BMW could certainly make the ratios lower and still let the car get decent mileage. Well, from a chassis control perspective and a grip perspective, it's certainly obvious that this car has way more of both. The grip perspective is likely due to the tires. There's a huge amount of tire difference between what's on this car and the 20-year-old e39 M5. The tires are Continentals that are about 5 or 8 years old and are probably well past their prime. So that's a lot of the grip difference. But from a chassis control perspective, this car is just better all around. It's got more bump absorption, better control of the car. I guess actually the rebound damping on the M5 is better. I gotta say that this car does bounce a little bit more coming out of corners, and that's probably due to the fancy JRZ dampers that the M5 has. So that is nice. The steering in this car, neither car has a ton of feel, but this car is great from the perspective of turn-in. The steering is quicker and more accurate. The e39 M5 was never lauded for its steering feel, and even today it doesn't get any better. The car has a good amount more mid-range power. I'd say that the M5 might actually pull just as hard or harder up top, but it's not a huge difference. Be nice to do a quick roll-on with the cars, but I do think the m340i feels faster, and the numbers show it too. Car and Driver tested a Dynan S2 M5 at a 12.7 quarter mile, and the m340i should handily beat that. Sound-wise, well, there's no comparison. The M5 definitely sounds better. I don't think the m340i sounds bad. It's certainly better than a lot of the turbo 4-cylinders that are very common right now, but it's definitely not a melodious V8. They redline at about the same RPM. Man, the m340i has so much more mid-range though. Even though the throttle response is not quite as crisp as it is in the M5, the amount of power the car has at these mid-throttle openings or the lower RPMs is definitely better. The m340i, interestingly enough, feels smaller than the M5. I mean, even though they're about the same, similar wheelbases, similar weights, this car definitely feels more compact. I'm guessing the newer suspension and maybe a slightly shorter wheelbase helps that. But this car definitely feels more compact, is easier to place in turns. Probably a lot of that is also due to having more accurate steering and having all the bushings and connections in the car be new. amount of bite the front end has in the M340i is also just way superior. I know that Dynon puts camber plates as part of their S2 package so that there's additional negative camber up front, and that car does feel like it turns in better than I remember in E39 M5, but this car still turns in better. It's got more precision from the helm, less understeer, more accurate steering. Normally when there's 20 years that separate cars, a lot of what you notice about the older car is a greater connection to the road and more feedback from either the steering or chassis. But in this case, the E39 M5 is really not about connection to the driver. You definitely get more connection from rowing your own gears with the manual transmission, but I don't think that you get a tremendous more amount of feedback from the road. This car is easier to place, it feels lighter, it feels smaller, the steering is more accurate and faster. There's not a whole lot of feel in either steering, but they feel similar from that perspective. This car is quieter and feels better screwed together, but 20 years of age and 75,000 miles separate the cars, so I'm not particularly surprised about that. All right, let's do a similar walkthrough of the M340i interior. Well, first of all, I mean, the huge difference is, of course, the fact that there's no gauges in the car. There's no discrete screens, just the nav. The center consoles, you can certainly see how they're related, but BMW, you got to bring back buttons for the climate control. You're killing me. Even the chiclets in the E39 are much easier to use than the stupid touchscreen that has a delay between me hitting the climate button and the climate control coming up. And I shouldn't have to go through a menu for that. That's silly. And we got away from these bar graphs in the 80s. I mean, it's so much less information. You can't tell as much. I really prefer the gauges in the E39. And you've got this entire screen to give me gauges, so give me gauges. Other than that, materials in this car are markedly nicer. Even though this has the Sensitech interior, the Sensitech feels nicer than the leather and the M5. This actually has the Sensitech dashboard also, which is wrapped vinyl, but still looks nice, and has the stitching. Certainly the A-pillars and roof are not as nice as the Alcantara that's in the M5. But yeah, not a whole lot of other things that are make this car distinctive. I will say that I hate not having the climate control as buttons. Not having seat heater buttons is also silly. So come on, BMW, you can do better. I know there's a lot of people that are going to be disappointed to hear that I didn't love the E39 M5, but it's a 20-year-old car, and unfortunately, I am just not really an old car kind of guy. I like new cars, I like the amenities, I like the nice stuff. This is a great car. They were amazing in their time, and they're still fun to drive today. So it definitely says something that a 20-year-old car can still capture underdriveness as this does. But I gotta say, I like my M340i better. Before all of you E39 M5 fanboys fillet me, well, just realize that yeah, I'm not an old car kind of guy, and that's what I think. Sorry.
Well, the E39 M5 didn't really excite me all that much. I actually owned an E60 M5, and man, that motor and the combination of the comfort and the incredible motor and the specialness of that car got my hopes pretty high for the E39 M5. And truth be told, I'd actually driven them before. I've driven an M5 both on the street and on the track, but it wasn't in the context of modern cars. And unfortunately, in the context of modern cars, well, the 3 Series is what a 5 Series used to be, but it's kind of a better 5 Series than the E39 5 Series ever was. The motor in the E39 M5 is certainly something special. It's really awesome to be able to have a high revving V8 with a manual transmission, but the car seems to be really let down by its flaccid and slightly numb and blah or circulating ball steering. And the chassis control, well, let's say BMW just made some pretty significant strides over the past 20 years. And I really like the car I bought. So there you have it. I guess all you E39 M5 fanboys can come running over to my channel with pitchforks. I'm sure we're going to get some hate in the comments, but yeah, sorry, it just wasn't the right car for me. So I think the M340i is actually a better E39 M5 in just about every measure.